Welcome back to the discovery. Settle into a comfortable place. Relax. And get ready to listen closely. You can simply close your eyes and let our story surround you. Or, if you prefer, follow the images we've prepared to illustrate the deep historical and philosophical principles we'll explore today. Have you ever wondered whether the idea of the 7 deadly sins is only part of the story we've been told? It shows up in films like Say 7 and in anime, on the steps of Dante's Purgatory, and even in the infernal princes of demonology. But what few people know is that this famous list hasn't always had 7 items. And they haven't always been seen strictly as sins. In fact, its history is long and full of twists, beginning long before Christianity itself. It was shaped by Greek and Roman thinkers, by Jewish sages, and it took millennia to finally settle into the theological form we know today. Today we're going to uncover how this list arose and evolved. But first, let's recall which 7 sins appear in the current list by looking at a fascinating painting. Hieronymus Bosch's The 7 Deadly Sins and the 4 Last Things, dated to around 1500. This is an excellent place to start. The 4 last things, death, resurrection, heaven, and hell, are in the corners of the panel. But what really interests us is the central roundel, which displays the 7 sins. Clockwise we find gluttony, acedia, lust, pride, wrath, envy, and avarice. The term acedia may sound strange to modern ears. You're probably more used to the word sloth, but we'll explain this important variation shortly. Also, I'll use the terms pride, superbia, and avarice to stay faithful to the Latin sources we'll explore. At the center of the roundel, Christ watches, accompanied by the phrase beware, beware, the Lord is watching you. This reinforces the idea of divine vigilance and that giving into these sins can lead to the worst of destinies, as the hell visible in the lower left corner of the work suggests. Thus, Bosch's list shows us the classic 7 deadly sins: gluttony, acedia, lust, pride, wrath, envy, and avarice. Of course, Bosch didn't create this list. Traveling 100 years earlier, from Bosch's Netherlands to England, we find an anonymous text called the Lantern of Light. This text is fascinating because it presents a group of 7 chief demons, each governing one of the 7 sins. The classification was Lucifer for pride, Beelzebub for envy, Satan for wrath, Abaddon for sloth, Mammon for avarice, Belphegor for gluttony, and Asmodeus for lust. Other authors, like Peter Binsfeld, later adjusted this roster of demons. But the 7 principal sins remain the same ones we recognize today. We can go even further back in time, this time to Italy, where we find another famous representation in Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy. The work narrates a journey through the afterlife, passing through hell, purgatory, and paradise. Hell, with its circles, devotes each one, except the first, to a specific punishment for a sin. The second circle punishes the lustful, the third the gluttons, and the fourth the avaricious. However, the full list of the 7 sins as we know it appears only in purgatory. There, Dante describes a mountain divided into 7 terraces where the sins are purged. With each terrace conquered, the ascent becomes easier. The terraces are, in order: pride, envy, wrath, sloth, avarice, gluttony, and lust. Once again we find the complete list, showing its stability in that period. But if we step back a little further, the story becomes less stable. In the 11th century, Thomas Aquinas wrote the Summa Theologica, one of the most influential works in Christianity. In this monumental work he explores the question of sins in depth. He was probably the one who popularized the expression deadly sins. Although Pope Gregory the Great had already used the term capital vices in the 6th century, it was Thomas Aquinas who coined the expression we know today. The reason for the name capital comes from the Latin caput, meaning head. For Aquinas, some sins are heads that give rise to others. But which sins were capital for Thomas Aquinas? In fact, there were 8, with an important distinction. The 7 are vainglory, envy, wrath, acedia, avarice, gluttony, and lust. Notice that pride, superbia, isn't in this list. And vainglory is not a synonym for pride for him. Aquinas differentiates the two precisely. Vainglory is vanity, the desire for glory for the wrong reasons. Pride, by contrast, is failing to recognize one's true condition, thinking oneself greater than one truly is. For Aquinas, pride was the worst of all sins, because it leads to insubordination, especially against God. Therefore he considered it not a capital sin, but the head of the capital sins, the queen and mother of all sins, as he himself described it. Thus, his list was really 7 plus 1, with pride reigning above the others. It's important to note that Aquinas' reflection was based on earlier thinkers. His chief authority was Pope Gregory the Great, who in turn drew on John Cassian in the 5th century, who drew from the ideas of Evagrius Ponticus in the 4th century. We can consider Evagrius Ponticus the true father of the list of the 7 deadly sins. However, there's a curious detail. His list wasn't of sins, and it didn't have 7 items. Let me explain. Evagrius, a leader of a monastic community in Egypt, wrote a treatise to combat the 8 evil thoughts. It's from these 8 thoughts that the list evolved. He says, there are 8 general and basic categories that contain all evil thoughts. The first is gluttony, then lust, avarice, sadness, wrath, acedia, vainglory, and lastly pride. He concludes that we cannot prevent these thoughts from troubling us, but we can decide whether they will remain in us. In this list, pride and vainglory appear together, but there's no mention of envy. Acedia appears alongside sadness. And, as I mentioned, Evagrius called them evil thoughts or daimons, the Greek term that gave rise to our word demons, not sins. In this context, acedia is the temptation to distract oneself and avoid spiritual duties. Evagrius noticed that monks, dissatisfied with the rigorous life, fantasized about an easier life and neglected their obligations. Acedia, therefore, is negligence and lack of motivation towards spiritual exercises. Sadness, in his list, is the regret for having embraced monastic life and abandoned worldly pleasures. Hence acedia and sadness are similar, representing a discouragement and a flight of mind that lead to inaction. From here comes the confusion and instability in the list, where sloth often adds to these concepts or takes their place. As I mentioned at the beginning, the history of this list reaches even further back, before Evagrius and before Christianity itself. The key to understanding this is the term capital vices, used by Pope Gregory. The reflection behind the deadly sins is similar to the Greeks and Romans' pursuit of the art of living well. For Aristotle, for example, it was crucial to know the vices and virtues in order to avoid or cultivate them. In his work on rhetoric, he lists 6 virtues and their opposing vices. Justice opposed to injustice, courage to cowardice, moderation to intemperance, and so on. That list appearing in a text on the art of persuasion is no coincidence. In Greco-Roman culture, identifying vices and virtues was essential both for moral education and for oratory. Cicero and Horace, masters of Roman rhetoric, also created lists of vices before Christ, with many parallels to the future lists of sins. One of Horace's lists, for example, includes avarice, envy, wrath, sloth, and lust, among others. The lists aren't limited to Greco-Roman culture. In ancient Judaism, another vital matrix for Christianity, we also find lists of vices that influence the development of the deadly sins. The most interesting appears in the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, a text from the 2nd century BCE. It speaks of 7 vices or 7 spirits of deception: fornication, gluttony, strife, vainglory, pride, falsehood, and injustice. Gluttony, vainglory, and pride appear with the same names as in the Christian lists. Fornication and strife can be understood as lust and wrath. Thus, we already find 5 of the deadly sins among these spirits of deception. A curious detail is that in Greek the word for injustice, adikia, is very similar to the word for acedia, acedia. It's possible that these words were confused over time, allowing acedia to enter the list and injustice to drop out. In short, the brief history of the 7 deadly sins is a fascinating journey that runs from Greco-Roman moral philosophy and Jewish tradition, through the spiritual discipline of Christian monks, to medieval and contemporary art. This has been only a glimpse into a subject so deep. If this journey made you reflect, I invite you to join our community. We're a growing channel and would greatly appreciate your support. Consider leaving your rating of this content, and comment below with your impressions so we can keep improving. A big hug, and thank you for watching.